Hello and welcome to Citrix Converge. My name is Angelo Saracino, Product Manager on Virtual Apps and Desktops. Before we get into today's talk, a brief disclaimer. All of the information presented in this video should not be used for purchasing decisions. All of the information provided is provided for informational purposes only. In today's talk, we're going to be discussing the Virtual Apps and Desktops APIs. The Virtual Apps and Desktops APIs are a suite of RESTful endpoints that allow you to consume Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops using any HTTP client. Many of you might be familiar with our PowerShell SDKs. The Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops APIs aims to offer the same SDK actions via REST. This enables a suite of new functionality that we'll get into later. In today's talk, we'll be first getting into an overview of what these APIs are and what use cases you can use these for to start building on them. We'll talk about ways to authenticate and to make your first GET request. Next, we'll talk about the features and route collections that you have made available to admins and developers. We'll talk about common verbs, structures, and considerations when making requests and building applications on these APIs. Third, we'll look at common examples of how to implement these APIs into your own projects. We'll look at collections and routes. We'll look at doing common tasks and runbooks, and we'll do a little bit of pair programming together. Finally, we'll wrap up and provide a brief summary of what we covered today. We'll talk about the roadmap of these APIs, and we'll also discuss the ways of how we're going to be planning to release these APIs to the broader public. We have a lot to cover in this video, so let's jump right into it. Let's get into the Virtual Apps and Desktops APIs then. Before we get into it, however, I want to share a brief moment of history when we were first developing the modern version of Studio. Many of you might be familiar about our efforts to transition off of the old MMC-based Studio over to Web Studio, now called Modern Studio. We realized that the remote PowerShell SDKs that we were calling were not the interfaces that we needed to be able to build the web-based version. What we decided to do initially was to wrap the PowerShell SDK calls in a suite of RESTful endpoints that eventually became what we called the orchestration service. Over time, we've been able to build additional functionality that is more cloud native to allow us to handle the scale that our admins expect from us. As we've been making this journey, we understood that when we were releasing Modern Studio Tech Preview, we wanted to be able to allow our admins to have the same access to the business logic under the hood. However, in MMC Studio, you can see this in the PowerShell tab. We might have plans in the future to include a similar analog called the API tab to see what the Modern Studio calls whenever you make an action into our interface. Let's talk about our release plan. At first, you're going to be seeing all of our route information and documentation hosted at a Swagger link. Swagger is an API portal that allows our developers to share information about the route and what information that it might return, such as response codes and payload information. As routes become documented along with runbooks, we'll be posting these route collections into our developer portal. At least in the meantime, we have our Swagger documentation available in the link in the video description. And starting today, we'll be having our delivery groups and machine catalogs route collections documented with runbooks in our developer portal. These runbooks will be available in 3 languages: PowerShell, Python, and C#. according to developer demand, we might be able to add more languages if you request it. So be sure to send us feedback. As these routes are completed, currently they'll be under what we call the Tech Preview URI. This is temporary. Just because the routes are currently in Tech Preview, however, does not mean that they're expected to change. These APIs are being used by other Citrix teams and ourselves to be able to deliver services in production. We do not expect the route design to change, and if there are any changes, we will clearly communicate any disruptions to the API design. However, our true plan with the route release in terms of the URIs will be to release them under a V1 route, while leaving the Tech Preview routes available for usage until we've been able to properly communicate that these routes will be deprecated. We want our admins and developers to start building on these immediately so we can collect all the feedback that we need. We've been listening and hearing all of our customers and admins from our Tech Preview, and they mentioned that they wanted to have routes allow them to bridge the gap in their cloud migration strategy, allow them to automate existing tasks, and to build third-party dashboards for use of their own partner operations or their own employee operations. We're always collecting feedback on these APIs, and we want you to join the conversation. We have a number of discussion boards, and myself and the engineering team will be checking the Converge Slack for questions and information or suggestions. We're really excited about what we've been working on this past year, and we're very excited to help you, our developers and admins, be able to help folks work from anywhere, anytime. In order to use these APIs, you need a Citrix Cloud API client. You can get this under the Identity tab in Citrix Cloud. We've been working with our partner teams over in the Citrix Cloud team to make it so that the authentication token that you get from the Citrix Cloud API client is longer than 1 hour. We'll let you know once these updates happen, and always we're working to make sure the developer experience of these APIs are optimal for everyone working on them. Now, since we have that covered, let's go move on to talking about the routes available and the features that you should expect using these APIs. That was a brief overview of what we had for the APIs. Now, let's speak to the functionality of what these APIs offer. But first, I want to get into the differences between the PowerShell SDK, which many of our admins and developers are familiar with, and the APIs. First, I want to speak to the sequential execution model that PowerShell offers to developers. For those of you familiar with PowerShell, your scripts execute from top to bottom. This is known as synchronous execution. In RESTful, which is a style of implementation, the browser, which is what RESTful APIs were initially intended for, executes code asynchronously, meaning that the browser cannot wait until code executes to continue browsing. So network requests are done in the background and, upon completion, show up in the browser. It's similar to like ordering at a restaurant. You place your order, and then you wait until it retrieves. The restaurant wouldn't exactly wait for your order to get to you before serving the next customer. This is what a mental model that developers and admins need to keep in mind when developing for the APIs. For those of you who might be giving a request to the APIs that might take a little long, a good example is provisioning, say, 100 VMs. You're going to get maybe a 202 as a response, meaning that the job kicks off and it's all going well, but you're not going to expect the payload back. Two other things I also want to speak to in terms of the differences between the PowerShell SDK and the APIs are the metaphors and verbs that we use, meaning that you might have a slight difference in the commandlet name versus what you might want to do in the APIs. Don't worry, we've accounted for this, and we'll be including a guide later on to explain the difference between common runbooks and actions under PowerShell and the equivalent code in an API at a later date. Now, since we covered that, let's go move on to the routes. There are 29 route collections in our API, ranging from the most common, like machines, machine catalogs, delivery groups, applications, and administrators. But you might see route collections that are rich with functionality, but might have new nomenclature that you might not be used to. A good example is sessions and tags. We understand for our admins and developers that our APIs might be something new and different to be working with. So that's why in our documentation, as we release it out to Developer Portal, we'll be having these runbooks with these common scenarios, as mentioned before. But let's take a moment to look into what you can expect to be using when you are engaging with the URIs in these APIs. Let's talk about machine catalogs, for example. Machine catalogs are groupings that we use in Studio to organize and catalog machines. These machines can be of varying type and can be assigned to a multitude of users using delivery groups. In the machine catalogs object, we can do simple things like create, delete, and edit. As shown here, these are the list of verbs and actions that you can undertake with this route collection. As you can see, there are a number of things you can possibly do with these APIs. You can add machines to an existing catalog. You can be able to modify certain parameters of the machine catalog. Standard actions and interfaces that if you can do in Studio, you can also do in the APIs. But let's take a moment and explore two route collections that might be of interest to our developers and admins. This is our Sessions API and our Machines API. Many of our admins in Studio use Studio as a search function to filter sessions and find machines. We know this works fantastic for our power users. So, by exposing these APIs in a separate route collection, we think our admins and developers can take exceptional use of these routes. Under Sessions, you can see that you can send a message to a logged on session, log off sessions by ID, and enumerate all sessions. For our admins and developers who've been using scripts or automation tooling, this is fantastic to be able to pull out information that you might have done manually in the past, or with using our PowerShell SDK. Then, let's take a moment to explore machines. The Machines APIs expose robust single VM modification tools and routes that give our admins granular control over the VM. You can log off all sessions per machine, and you can even create single machines on a host connection. There's a lot of routes and a lot of functionality you can do with these machines. You can even tag straight down to the specific machine ID. This is something that's been long requested from a lot of our admins for these APIs. So, in these 29 collections, there's a lot to explore. And we encourage our admins and developers to play around with the APIs and see the functionality that we have in store. Here's a list of all of the route collections that we have available. These are too many for us to go in this video, but I definitely encourage you to review our documentation and guides over this period of time to make sure to see if we can offer the functionality you need. And we're always listening for feedback. So if there's any specific functionality that's available in PowerShell SDK that we haven't yet exposed, please let us know so we can prioritize accordingly. That's all we have for routes. Now, let's jump into some examples. Before we jump into our examples, let's run through a pre-flight checklist to make sure we have everything we need to make our first request. First, we assume you have a valid Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop subscription. Second, we assume that you have your cloud connectors set up. Then, we also assume you have a Citrix Cloud API client and client secret. Lastly, we assume that you have your customer ID and site ID. If the site ID looks unfamiliar to you, don't worry, we'll cover that later. For more information, you can check out the link below. Now, let's get into the different types of URI patterns that you might be seeing in this presentation. At the top is our tech preview URI structure. We used to do this because the DDC needed to be directly called. What you would do is you would pass in your customer ID and your site ID in the parameter. Now, as the routes approach general availability, we'll be putting them behind an API gateway. In this URI format, you'll need to pass in the customer ID in the headers. Don't worry, both formats will be supported for some time to come. Now let's also talk about a certain delimiter. $sign indicates action for some post requests. You might see this often in our APIs. Now, let's talk about structuring our requests. In order for us to make successful requests, we need to make sure our headers are in order. For tech preview routes using the older format, all you need to pass through is an authorization token. You must do this by structuring with capital B, bearer, space, then a token value generated from the Citrix Cloud API. Keep in mind, tokens have an expiration. For those of you using the API gateway, you need to pass in the customer ID. The format is as follows: Citrix-customer ID, and then you pass in the customer ID. We'll get through an example later. But next, let's see how we can get our site ID. Now, the site ID is a simple route under the Me route. It's a route used to get the list of customers and sites. For most of us, it's a one-to-one relationship. For CSPs, they might have multiple sites tied to their customer. Now, after we perform our get onto this request with the authorization token, we should see an array of customers along with the associated sites with those customers. We pull out the ID, and we'll be using this for the rest of our routes. Now, let's go into a common scenario that our admins have been asking for: tagging VMs based on criteria. This is a common action that admins can use to be able to organize their virtual machines, and we'll jump into how we can do so. First, we're going to need to perform a search to find the VM that we want to tag. As you can see here, the delimiter with the $sign, search, and the limit helps us get the first 100 machines related to our search query. Then, we'll use the API to tag those VMs. Let's get to it. With the expected payload, what we do is we pass in a payload with a search string to be able to search similar names to those VMs. Or, for those of you familiar with the Studio interface, we can pass in filters to help refine our search. After we send the payload, we receive a response with a list of machines most relevant to our search. We can take the name or ID and store it somewhere to pass to our next request. After we take this information, we're ready to start tagging those VMs. So, via the route, we're able to pass through a tag within the route itself without having to send an explicit payload. Follow these two routes, and you'll be able to tag VMs based off criteria. Now, let's get into an example where we see some code. Creating a physical machine catalog is something that many of our admins have to do. As you can see here, I have a function signature made in Python. And we also have our route machine catalogs using the API gateway. As mentioned, we'll have to authenticate them to a different way to be able to use this route. As you can see here, I import request, which is a common HTTP client library used in Python. And you might notice that the fact that I am passing in the bearer token, customer ID, and site ID in the function arguments. Then I used part of the function arguments, the site ID, to create the request URI. If you notice, I have a curly brackets with 0 in it to help us with string interpolation. We're doing this to make sure that we have the proper site ID in the URI. Now, let's talk about headers. Since this is a route using the API gateway, we have to pass in the customer ID. You can see this in the following object. We pass in our bearer, we interpolate the token in the string. We pass in the ID, then we specify the content type and the acceptance type, both of them JSON. Here's where the real logic comes in. In order to create a machine catalog, the API expects a machine catalogs object. We can constantly check the documentation to make sure that we're using the fields that the API accepts. In this case, for practical purposes, we'll be keeping the object as small as possible. So we'll send a payload with name, the type, remote PC, the functional level, user changes, session support, and the provisioning type. Many of you who are familiar with CVAD might recognize a lot of these fields. And there was even more fields that you can modify whenever you're submitting your object for the machine catalog. However, for now, we'll keep it small. We take all this data and get it to be able to be wrapped in a request.post method. After we do this, we should be able to get a response from the API. Admins and developers can use a script as we speak to try out the API themselves. And we have plenty more runbooks of a similar sort in .NET and Python, including PowerShell. Do we also try these out as well? That's all the examples we have so far. Now let's go back to the studio. Well, those were quite a bit of examples. Before we close out here today, I want to just recap and tell you what we just talked about. 1, these APIs are ready to use as we speak. Just because they have the tech preview route doesn't mean that they are exactly beta quality. These are battle tested in production. Our automated configuration tool uses these exact same APIs to help our on-prem admins move from their on-prem sites into the cloud. Our Modern Studio Tech Preview also has these APIs calling at cloud native and scale rates. These Tech Preview has been able to help our admins be able to navigate into the pandemic efficiently with the fastest search we've been able to ever deliver to our admins. In addition to that, our runbooks will be releasing in a phased manner. In the same way for Modern Studio, we'll be releasing documentation and runbooks into the developer page as soon as the runbooks and documentation are ready. Although we don't have a final date for GA, this is a good springboard for us to be able to collect feedback as the routes are ready to be delivered. And for our more adventurous admins and developers, this would be wonderful for those folks to use the Swagger page to be able to investigate the functionality they have there. And just because they're not on the developer portal, we're always answering questions to help our admins and developers build the integrations and products they need. However, moving forward as we enter public tech preview, we'll be standardizing our communication channels. We'll be using our Slack and Converge, and we'll be using the discussion pages that we have in our discussion boards. Lastly, I want to close that we've been hearing you in terms of being able to have closer and tighter integrations into your public clouds or the products that you want to build internally or externally. So any use cases that we haven't yet covered in runbooks, we would love to hear what you want to build with them. And with that being said, that closes out my introduction to CVAD APIs. Please make sure to send me any feedback about this talk or our APIs, and happy hacking. Talk to you soon.